Fighting games have been tied to American comic books almost as long as fighters themselves have existed. This was never more prevalent than in the 90s, where fighters based on comics were coming out left and right, as well as the reverse, comics based on fighting games. Early on, a lot of these games didn't go deep into their lore beyond the attract mode sequences or character endings. Comics were perfect to take the little nuggets of info these games would dole out and expand it to make the lore their own. As popular as they were, fighting game stories weren't as well established as they are now. Comic writers adapting these stories had to get more creative. Sometimes a little too creative. I personally had a very narrow experience with traditional comics. Growing up, I read some Sonic comics and X-Men, and every now and then I'd get something different, but it was never a fighting game comic. These ones that we're talking about, I read for the first time like a month ago, and some of them are even older than I am. Street Fighter, being the first to set off the fighting game boom, has had a bunch of comics throughout the series' life, starting with probably the most infamous being the one made by Malibu Comics in '93. This might even be the first fighting game comic. I know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but this cover is honest about what you're in for here. The faces are just so ugly and deformed. I get making villains ugly to show kids these are the bad guys, but damn, they didn't have to do everybody this dirty. To be fair, if we look at what the artist had to go with for reference at the time, he didn't have that much. With only Street Fighter 2 being out, he probably assumed the graphics were a representation of the American box art of the home releases. These were more gritty and realistic, so perhaps he was going with that same angle. Regardless, even if the art style was incredible, it doesn't make up for the writing. This is not faithful to the tone of the games at all, to say the least. The writing is straight up character assassination, and I mean that literally. Ryu and Chun-Li have a relationship which is something that could work, but not in this way. Chun-Li's whole existence revolves around her getting stronger, so Ryu appreciates her more. It just makes her look pathetic. Sagat has killed a person or two in the games before, but even when he was with Shadaloo at his lowest point, he had a sense of honor buried deep down. But killing Ken and mailing his scalp to Ryu is a touch out of line. Malibu also thought it would be cool to cross over their own IP as well, their OC being called the Ferret. Of all the character designs to rip off of, they chose Aquaman. At least when the Ferret fights E Honda, he gets his ass handed to him. It's super one-sided too, he barely lays a finger on Honda. This comic was quickly cancelled after only 3 issues, since Capcom wasn't really digging Malibu's interpretation of their characters. In the final issue, Malibu wrote an apology that the comic had been cancelled, not for the quality mind you, which confirms Capcom was dissatisfied by the series. They detail where the story was gonna go, and it doesn't sound like they had anything interesting on the horizon. It's for the best. How did the Japanese comics of Street Fighter fare in comparison? Well, at least marginally better. The company Takuma published these in the same year as Malibu's comic in '93. This was actually a manga in Japan, and in the West, it was translated and printed as a comic series. The art style I much prefer over Malibu, but the plot is way more off the rails. The story is more Escape from LA than Street Fighter, where you have a lawless, sectioned off island in the US which is full of crime and hosts street fights regularly. The premise is that Ryu is passing by looking for worthy foes. Ryu is a little Goku-ified by coming off as a bit of a dumb oaf who loves his food. But hey, he hates spiders, now we can confirm they at least read the manual. Chun-Li comes off more faithful than the thirsty version from before, but some characters like Blanca were butchered. Blanca is just a monster that kills people and wants to join Shadaloo. They have these character profiles on each page that can help remind the reader who some of these characters are. Some even spoil plot points that haven't even happened yet. The writing can be pretty funny in a corny way. Guile's speech to Zangief always stuck out to me. Regarding the art style, I do like it, and it's that older manga look where things are a bit more minimalistic. The covers are also pretty sick. Guile and Zangief even did the iconic underdog stare down before Akuma and Ryu did. I think the art style alone puts it above the Malibu comic despite it being less story accurate. I would have assumed being in Japan they could have gotten a more accurate plot, but I think this property was just too new, and companies didn't really care since they saw it as cashing in on a fad. It'd be some years until Street Fighter had American comics again, but we'll get to that later. Virtua Fighter, trying to advertise itself outside of Japan, released a one-shot comic made by Marvel, and it's cool seeing these characters drawn in a more Western style. I suppose Sega loved this so much they used it as the box art for a Virtua Fighter remix. The comic itself, though, seems to struggle with its tone as well. Right on the first page, the problem is clear. The atmosphere is dark and gritty, like we're starting a Batman story. This issue more so sets up the vibe, and nothing of any real story value actually happens. To be fair to the writer, they again didn't have anything to work off of. Yes, the tone of the games is more spry and colorful, but they don't go into the story at all. You'd have to just read the instruction manuals, and even those barely had anything. The writer just created the kind of stories popular in the 90s, which were dark and edgy ones. Through the entire series of Virtua Fighter, the story doesn't just take a back seat, it's stuffed in the trunk and left to rot. I can't even tell you if the characters are written right or not. I have no clue what their personalities are beyond their win animations in-game. Plot-wise, this takes place in Virtua City and just follows select characters preparing for a tournament. Serious Comics published 4 issues of Primal Rage in 1996, and this was pretty on the spot with its plot. The grittier tone fits this series since it's essentially Mortal Kombat with giant creatures. The main protagonist is Blizzard, and since this ice variant of King Kong doesn't talk, he has one of the tribe leaders talk on his behalf as a spokesman. That works for the most part. I would have preferred something like the Gon manga where there's no dialogue at all and everything is just conveyed with the art alone. But I get them not going in that direction since that'd be a little bold. Diablo acts as the main antagonist, and the story is mainly just setting up the showdown between him and Blizzard. Was only able to get my hands on the first issue, but from what I've read it isn't too bad. I'd love to have the other issues for the cover art alone, but those are way rarer and more expensive than this issue. Also, interesting that the cut character Slash Fang makes a brief appearance, and they also advertise Primal Rage too. Counting their eggs before they hatch a bit. This isn't a bad first issue since it's not just exposition dumps, and there's actually a fight and stakes on the table here. Rare's Killer Instinct had 2 comic runs in the 90s, one from Armada and another from Acclaim Comics. These are pretty easy to mix up since they both use the official 3D renders as their cover, not to mention the art style of the comics themselves are very similar. If you read the Armada run first, followed by Acclaim, it would just come off as a small time jump in the plot, just with a focus on a different main character, and perhaps that was the intention. They both capture the tone and the stories of the games. This essentially acts as an extension of that world and gives fans a chance to give Ultratech's evil a face, having its head chairman act as the driving force for its characters. Like the games, it doesn't take itself too seriously, it leans into its cheese a bit more. This particular run added to the lore that Thunder's brother is Fulgor. Not sure if this was the first medium to add that as lore over the game, but it's a good addition to make Fulgor more than a mindless drone. It gives him more of a tragic backstory, and allows one of them to be unique since there is multiple Fulgors and we gotta make the one we play as feel special by comparison. Gotta be honest though, neither of these really caught my interest all too much. The world's just a bit too hokey for me, and I get that's the point, but being too tongue-in-cheek means they're not focused on making characters of any substance. Thankfully, that would be improved with the series' next run. Leaping forward a couple of decades, the company Dynamite released the run for Killer Instinct 2013. The art is very well done and far more detailed than any comic we've discussed so far. As for the story, well, it doesn't catch the reader up on the story at all. This seems to act more as a sequel to Killer Instinct 2, or perhaps it's for Killer Instinct 2013. They reference beating Gargoyles with Tusk, but I don't know if it's a second game they mean, since one of the stages in that game appears in this battle, or if Killer Instinct 2013 retold that in its story. Regardless, we just jump in what feels like the middle, and there's not really a recap on what got us here. To my surprise, this takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where people need to scavenge to survive. We mostly follow Kim Woo, who lost her mojo or whatever, and is trying to get it back. Jago and Tusk join her for the same personal goal. In finding their magical spiritual powers, they accidentally are confronted by Gargoyles. Reading this, I thought I had missed some issues, but no, this trade is everything. Perhaps I just missed a lot of lore in KI 2013, and this just picks up right after. The main cast personalities are established pretty well, but Kim Woo in particular says some pretty cringe shit. The final battle with Gargoyles is pretty awesome. It sets the stakes well, and the trio has an uphill battle since they don't have their powers and weapons. Gargoyles' powered up redesign is one of the raddest things I've seen. His muscles all exposed, and he even has Baraka blades. Wish he had this look in the games, honestly. In their journey to reach Gargoyles, they run into other characters that help them and hinder them in their journey. They don't try to stuff in as many characters as possible for a cameo fest, thankfully. There is the one odd subplot of a vampire army trying to rule the world. I knew about Mira, but who's this guy? Why is there so much focus on him and these vampires? This comic isn't bad at all, I just wish they attempted to catch up plebs like me that only know surface level lore and KI. My god, Tekken has it rough with comics. What I believe to be the first attempt is by Nightstone in '97. The plot has Kazuya fall off a cliff when fighting Heihachi as an adult, as opposed to Heihachi tossing Kazov himself as a child. In the game, what made Kazuya compelling is despite him being evil, he comes off as a victim since his father robbed him of a childhood at such an early age. Kazuya surviving that shaped him into the villain he would become. Here, Kazuya just comes off as an idiot. He was already an asshole before this, so falling off is all on him. The second issue straight up being called Tekken 2 drops the saga subtitle. This is confusing since it gives the impression that this isn't a continuation of that comic since there's not a number 2 to indicate the issue. The end of this comic called this series Tekken 2, so the saga branding is just gone. Perhaps that comic was so bad that they wanted to trick readers into picking this up. This cover is fucking awful. This is the photo edition, and I don't know what they were going for here. Is this supposed to be Nina versus a Jack? Or perhaps a stand-in for the audience? Whatever. In this issue, Konomitsu jumps Yoshimitsu and Kazuya. Yoshimitsu loses his hand very casually. He doesn't seem to be bothered by it, so I guess I shouldn't be either. This fight is over so quick anyways. When the Iron Fist tourney starts, the Tekken cast beats up characters from other fighters like Vega, Guile, Sagat, Chun-Li, Sub-Zero, and maybe this is supposed to be Terry but green. The art is not for me. You'll get some real nightmare faces every so often. What's funny is that the ads in this comic highlight this even more. I'll be hit with this manga ad and it makes the art in the comic look a bit shit. Might have been a genius move for those manga companies, cause man is it a sight for sore eyes. There were plans for a third issue, but that was thankfully scrapped. Images of it can still be found online, but this comic is best left forgotten. In 2001, Image Comics released a one and done of their version of a Tekken comic. Ironically called Tekken Forever, it was cancelled after one issue. Must have been so good, they knew they couldn't top it. This story is meant to take place between Tekken 3 and 4, but also assumes Tag 1 is canonical with unknown present. The issue starts with various fighters defeated to the song Let the Bodies Hit the Floor by Drowning Pool. And you know what? Kazuya is vibing a bit to it. The story sadly isn't interested in catching up the reader on what's going on, not just for a newcomer. I know a lot of Tekken lore, and if this takes place after 3, how would we have gone here? Everybody comes after a revived Kazuya with Heihachi and Unknown here in Egypt? I need a little bit more of an explanation. There's a point where Jin starts to awaken his true power, but it's not when fighting Kazuya, it's when fighting Hwoarang, which doesn't seem right. Jin has a rivalry with Hwoarang, sure, but it's not one he takes seriously. The art, I'm mixed on. It's certainly better than Tekken Saga, but sometimes the characters can look a bit gnarly and others look great. The tone comes off a bit harsher than Tekken is in the games, with characters cursing more and random gore. I don't care about these things normally, but that's not really in the spirit of Tekken. Lei saying bitch like 3 times in one sentence? Bro, chill. The cancelled second issue also has some images online floating around, and I would have been more interested in this run continuing than the previous. You'd think that in 2017 this misfire in tone wouldn't happen again, but here comes Tekken Blood for you to prove me wrong. Published by Titan Comics, this takes place before Tekken 7 and follows Jin and Xiao Yu off to confront Kazuya and Heihachi. This tone still comes off as much harsher than expected. Tekken's story is about a family that's trying to kill each other, but they have a lot of levity in between all that. Characters like Panda are a testament to that. Here, they gun her down with other characters just to have them resurrect as angels. I still don't get the sense that the tone of Tekken has ever been captured accurately in American comics. Jin just comes off more an asshole than usual. I suppose this personality is a holdover from Tekken 6. This story just comes off as more mean-spirited than normal too. Titan has produced excellent video game comic adaptations before with its Bloodborne series. When I heard they published a Tekken comic, I was confident this one was going to be just as great as the Bloodborne ones, much to my disappointment. This Tekken run was 4 issues, but unlike the others, it ended on its own terms and is much easier to follow in its first issue. The art style seems pretty good, thankfully, but the story is just where it falls apart for me. Thankfully, this story seems to be non-canonical to Tekken's plot and game. A year after Malibu Comics published their short-lived Street Fighter series, they adapted Mortal Kombat. This series is much better than Street Fighter, and the art and the writing is vastly better in comparison. The tone of those Street Fighter comics was more akin to Mortal Kombat anyways. Surprisingly, this comic doesn't go super crazy with the gore like Street Fighter did. They also publish many sub-series, which makes things hard to follow. How many #1 issues do they really need here? Even Baraka got his own comic. I wonder if Mortal Kombat being an American brand made it easier for Malibu to communicate the tone and the characters they should be striving for, as opposed to Street Fighter, where they probably were just sent materials from Japan and had to do the best with what they were given. That being said, the series wasn't incredible or anything. It had a lot of weird moments, and they dragged out the first 2 games' story a bit. But they had some interesting ideas, like humanizing Baraka a little more than just a monster jobber. Their design of Shao Kahn without his mask looks pretty sick. In Shaolin Monks, Kahn gets his helmet destroyed, and him maskless looks just like the Malibu comic version. The company did stop publishing MK comics before the 3rd game released. Malibu did, however, return to publish the MK Deceptions Collector's Edition comic, which is actually canon to the story. None of the comics discussed are actually canon to any of their game's plot. Sometimes they can be very close to it, but comics like these are rarely acknowledged by the games themselves. In '92, Mortal Kombat had a pre-order comic tie-in that gave background on the cast of the first game. This was actually made by people like John Tobias, who had a hand in the game's creation and development. This happened for MK2, MK4, and MK Deception as well. These were great bonuses that certainly added more official context for the plot and characters. After MK4, Tobias left Midway to pursue his own ventures in the industry. When MK vs. DC released, Tobias came back to work on the Collector's Edition comic with his fantastic art style. This was to give background on the creation of the main antagonist Dark Khan. In 2015, DC Comics published Mortal Kombat X. This run was officially canon and has been referenced multiple times in the games themselves. The art here is pretty fantastic. When some crazy gory money shot happens, it's captured really well and you can actually get a sense of how violent this world really is. Havoc is actually one of the main antagonists, and I think this is the version of him fans wanted for MK1. Havoc is all about chaos and he pulls a lot of strings from behind the scenes. He's like MK's Joker, I suppose. Also, where has his version of Kotal been hiding? The comic book version is a one-man army and gets shit done. In the games, dude gets his back hurt and gets his ass kicked in his own reveal trailer. The tone is a harsh and bloody one, maybe even more so than the games, and the world is violent and dark. I'm glad a lot of underutilized characters make an appearance here, like Frost, Movado, and Shujinko. Reiko and Scarlet are the other main antagonists before they appeared again in MK11 and 1 respectively, trying to gain power in Outworld by obtaining these blood knives that control other warriors and grant them power. Overall, this comic is great, and I wish DC kept this up. They don't even have to be canon, I just love to see more from them and what they would come up with. Another official story tie-in was with the crossover Multiversus. I didn't even know the game had a story at all until it returned from its paid beta test. The Rifts mode quickly mentions some characters solving multiverse problems, and is mostly just brief character interactions through voiceless text. The comic made by DC goes into how all of this began. The DC universe is the central world of the plot here. If you don't know who Mr. Miracle and Big Barda are, you might be a little lost that a chunk of their plot revolves around their daughter. Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman are trying to solve the mystery of what the other WB characters are doing in their world. The whole game's roster doesn't appear here. Instead, a select few are chosen to have central focus, which is for the best since the plot can get hard to keep track of if we have too many characters to focus on. There is the curious addition of the Wizard of Oz's Wicked Witch. Wizard of Oz has no representation in the game itself, and the witch was never included in the actual roster, but she did have voice files hidden in the game's code.
Pick a character! I know who I'd choose!
It's a shame, since she would have been an interesting addition, and that's never gonna happen since the game has been taken offline. The art style is more cartoony than what a typical DC story would use, but having characters like Shaggy and Bugs Bunny, they kinda have to. Having a grittier style just wouldn't suit those characters, especially with a Multiversus art style. The story though does go harder than I expected it to. Just because this is meant for kids doesn't mean they're trying to dumb down anything here. This short and sweet series isn't half bad, honestly. The most famous of all these is the Injustice series. The game brave enough to ask, what if Superman was evil? I'm being a dickhead, but the game story is very well done and just as good in the comics. It first acted as a prequel to the Injustice universe on how this even happened. The games just tell you Joker tricked Superman into killing Lois Lane and destroying Metropolis. The The comic goes into it in much more detail. It shows Superman's descent into fascism, and Batman and company having a schism in the Justice League. It just keeps escalating from one bad thing to another until we reach the point in the games. This series did keep going into its own long-running series even after the second game. They even had a crossover with He-Man, who isn't in any of the games at all. This series really just became its own beast. In terms of American comics, SNK has essentially nothing. For manga or manhwa, they're killing it, but the only American comic I could find, thanks to the price of reason, was The Last Blade. In North America, I believe this was a Five Below exclusive. This covers the first game's plot, and honestly isn't too bad. I believe this was a webcomic in Korea first, but then published in the US later. You definitely get the vibe that this came from a webcomic too, since they seem to try to fit a lot of panels into one page. Like, damn, I gotta squint just to read this sometimes. As someone who never really knew the story of Last Blade, this does act as a good primer. A series that is only a webcomic is Skullgirls. This can be read in its entirety for free on webtoons.com, and it's a fun read. It uses the fact that it's a webcomic to its advantage. If you're scrolling on a mouse or your phone, it uses its verticality and its art style. Might be one of my personal favorites. The writing is funny and the characters have great banter with each other. I love the art, and it's faithful to the amazing sprite work of the fighter and really allows the characters to be expressive. I never looked into the plot of the games before, but this comic does a great job at giving you the lowdown on the lore and who these characters are. They're able to pull this off without any huge exposition dumps too. The story mostly centers on Parasol and her group on a mission to expose the crime boss of the Medici and also stop the titular Skullgirl Marie. It acts as a prequel to the games and shows how some characters got their fantastical abilities. It does end on a dark note and one that feels like a cliffhanger, though it's hard to complain when the games pick up where this left off. The comic details a lot of the characters' motivations to find and kill the Skullgirl. The series has the perfect balance between humor and its more dark elements. I truly can't recommend this comic enough, even if you aren't a fan of the fighter. Udon is the only one of these publishers still producing fighting game comics today. Not just for Street Fighter, but also Darkstalkers, Rival Schools, and other Capcom properties. Their first one was with Street Fighter, and they knocked it out of the park with fantastic writing and illustrations. They do take some creative liberties, but I don't think they're anything bad. It does bug me though that Sagat got his famous scar in an underground fight opposed to the epic empty field, but this is just a nitpick. Some of Udon's canon even got inserted into the main plot of the games, like Cammy's sister and clone to Capray. The Udon comics I suppose could be considered canon until they're not. An example being like the Star Wars comics. The current ones are supposed to be canon until a movie or show contradicts it. This series became so popular, Udon was able to make spin-offs of other Street Fighter characters like Ibuki, Sakura, and even weirdos like Necro. Akuma and Sagat were given origin story spin-offs as well. Udon continued with the continuity of the games and are currently doing ones for Street Fighter 6. That series acts as a prequel to 6, explaining how Ken lost his financial status and context on who Luke and JP are, something I'd wish the games themselves would do a better job of. The characters' personalities in these comics I feel helped inspire and shape how they would act in the games from Street Fighter 4 onwards. Can't say if that's actually the case for sure, but Capcom does seem to like the work Udon has been doing for so long. Even in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, they used Udon's design for Taskmaster as his alt and got one of Udon's characters to Capray and made her a real character. Udon also gave a crack at a Rival Schools comic that unfortunately didn't prove as successful as Street Fighter. It was a single issue that had no color, which I assume was done to save costs. Although this comic didn't financially succeed, that doesn't mean these characters remain unused. They appear in Street Fighter stories quite frequently as supporting cast. Darkstalkers has a few issues of high-quality comics. This is just as good as the initial Street Fighter series and switches central focus between multiple main characters like Morrigan, Felicia, and Donovan. The story concludes on a cliffhanger teasing Jeddah, but this would hang for quite a few years. The story would finally pick up in Darkstalkers vs. Street Fighter, where Jeddah teams up with Guild to reset the universe. This is essentially the plot of Darkstalkers 3, but with Street Fighters involved, minus Ryu since he's training with Oro. The art of all of these series varies, but they always seem to capture an aesthetic that's fitting for not just Street Fighter, but Capcom games as a whole. I try to keep my eye out for newer Udon releases every now and then, since they mix it up with a lot of interesting ideas, be it a focus on a more obscure character, or an intercompany crossover of other Capcom series like Final Fight. Now, there are variant covers for a lot of comics, but that's all they are, covers. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite had a ton of comics with different covers promoting the game, but cracking them open, there's no Capcom character in sight. Some of these don't even match the series. Like, damn man, I'd assume that Spider-Man and Deadpool turned into demons in this story. A lot of these covers are truly bangers and just makes me wish that these were real stories. For the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, Marvel had the character portrait illustrations as variant covers. These series match the characters this time, but no Capcom characters present here. Just the one character, which does give it a clean, slick appearance. There are 4 true MVC comics, 3 of which are pack-ins for a specific version of the game. The first was included in the vanilla release of the collector's edition, and this essentially is the most and only plot you're given on these worlds crossing over. Various Marvel villains led by Doom are discussing with the sole Capcom villain Rep Wesker on how to use Galactus to rule the worlds or whatever. Capcom and Marvel heroes are fighting each other, and then Galactus pops up. That's it. The remaining pages are just a grab bag of art pieces, making this double as a mini art book. The cover has some character silhouettes, including one of Frank West, who's not playable in this version of the game. Oops. This comic was actually shown in its entirety in the game's Ultimate version intro. The next bonus comic would be for the physical PS4 and Xbox One re-release of Ultimate MVC 3. In the States, this physical copy was a GameStop exclusive, which included another mini comic. The story is, again, the Capcom and Marvel heroes fighting, but we have different matchups from the last issue. There's some banter between characters, and it ends with Galactus showing up. After this was another GameStop exclusive in the States, being a pre-order bonus for Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. This focuses on Black Panther and the Monster Hunter figuring out how their worlds have converged, with the issue ending on Ryu and Hulk about to fight a creature from Monster Hunter. The plot is almost all exposition and acts as a prequel of sorts to Infinite Story Mode, since when you get to Wakanda, Black Panther and Monster Hunter are already working together. If these games and comics take place in the same universe, I assume that Marvel vs. Capcom 3 takes place first, since the heroes don't know who each other are yet in the cinematic intros where they're fighting each other, whereas in Infinite, they're teamed up at this point. Lastly, in the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, another pack-in comic was included in the first run printing of the physical version. This comic is a bit beefier and feels like a complete story, even more than the MVCI one. Flipping through, you can already see it's much wordier than all the others combined, but it's just so damn tiny. We can blame the Switch boxes for this. They made one comic version to fit all boxes, and because the Switch is so narrow, they had to scale it to fit that too. Also, am I crazy, or does this comic smell like Play-Doh? The story follows select characters from the roster of MVC2, and Ruby Heart finally gets to do something. Who knows when this takes place in the MVC canon, if it's there at all. I'm gonna assume it's after all the games except for MVC2 itself, since that event isn't mentioned, and in that game, Ruby Heart gathers heroes and villains to defeat Abyss and save some plants, and they don't know each other here yet. The plot has Bison and Doom team up to conquer each other's worlds, and these select heroes have to stop them. Bison and Doom get desperate and summon Thanos and Akuma to whoop everyone's ass. The heroes do eventually overcome them by pitting Thanos and Akuma against each other, with the final scene being the heroes playing video games at the end of the day. Pretty wholesome. It was great seeing more of a story and the characters actually getting a chance to interact with each other more than just like one-line quips. With the second fighting collection with Capcom vs. SNK, they'll again include a comic in the physical copies. SNK vs. Capcom actually does have a plot, but Capcom vs. SNK is something with even less than Marvel vs. Capcom. It really just boils down to being 2 tournaments funded by Ken and Robert. If it's anything like this, I look forward to seeing how that turns out. And look at that, this comic came just in time before this upload. This first story is about a Capcom team of 3 composed of Ryu, Kyosuke, and Morrigan versus SNK's team of Kyo, Mai, and Haomaru. All 6 of these characters are perfect picks, since they all come from different fighters from their respective companies. It's a back and forth with cute banter between teams until the final match with Kyo and Ryu ends in a draw. There's even a second story in a more cartoony style showing after Joe and Dan's win from the first CBS tourney that they need a 3rd member for the next. They get rejected by different characters, and this one is pretty good too. This comic was made by Udon directly, and thankfully this one doesn't smell like Play-Doh like the MVC collection comic did. Going back and looking at the release of Street Fighter Cross Tekken, there was a comic included in its collector's edition as well. This was mostly setting up how the MacGuffin Pandora's Box was created, which it seems was by Capcom Fighting Jam's Ingrid. Kazuya teams up with Nina against Ryu and Chun-Li. Ryu's in-game partner is Ken, but I guess they wanted the two iconic women fighting each other. Kazuya and Ryu use Pandora's power and the comic ends, with the remaining pages having miscellaneous art. Not the best comic, but at least the game itself has more plot and back and forth between characters. There are some bigger standalone crossover stories that weren't based on games, just doing their own thing. These were only for Street Fighter from what I found, the first being Street Fighter Cross G.I. Joe. This is a cool full circle crossover since Street Fighter has had ties with the G.I. Joe brand since early on. The 90s movie and cartoon were essentially Street Fighter with the same format as a G.I. Joe show, and the toys were just repainted G.I. Joes. This starts right in the middle of a tournament, with the participants fighting against their will, this being orchestrated by Bison and Destro. I do like that there's some upsets, like Rufus of all people beating the Baroness, and Ryu losing to Jinx. With Ryu losing in particular, it's implied he trained her himself, which is how she uses a Shoryuken. Makes it more interesting than just Ryu having his butt whooped, especially if Jinx winning is what Ryu wanted anyways. They do all eventually team up and thwart Shadaloo and Cobra, and it's unfortunate a follow-up never happened, since what they teased at the end seemed like it could have been pretty cool. The next crossover was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles vs. Street Fighter. This follows the 4 Turtles and 4 Street Fighters teaming up to fight their respective main baddies Bison and Shredder, although they're not exactly on the same team. I'm a tad mixed on this. There's just a lot of elements that seem kinda off. The characterization of the Street Fighters just seems like someone's approximation of their personalities. I get that these personalities are broad already, but I can't exactly put my finger on what's wrong. Michelangelo also seems to have a crush on Chun-Li for some interspecies relationship, but to each their own. Bison shockingly lets Baxter Stockman yell at him a bunch. I'm not caught up on my Turtles lore, but who's this 5th one with the Wolverine claws? This comic wasn't awful, it just feels a bit generic, which I suppose it has to be since the story might have to play it safe for readers who aren't familiar with Street Fighter or TMNT. So, in terms of actually trying to read these, the newer ones like from Udon and DC's Mortal Kombat run can be read through digital comic services. The older ones are only available if you have a physical copy. For those, I just suggest finding scans online through whatever means are available to you. The older ones' quality are extremely low anyways, and I wouldn't suggest reading most of those unless you're a mega fan of that series. Udon still remains on top for the Street Fighter and Darkstalkers comics, but DC's Mortal Kombat was excellent as well, and it's a shame they never did another run. With MK1 being a pseudo-reboot, the comics can expand the ideas of that world further. MK games reference the comics lore all the time, so I'm confident NRS would be able to keep close ties with whatever canon the comics would establish. Virtua Fighter out of all of these needs a good comic more than anyone. They have so little lore in their own games, even if the comic wasn't necessarily canon, they could still supplement the games by establishing character personalities more. It's a bummer that Udon's Capcom comics are the only fighting game comic around. There's nothing for anyone else. Some series do have manga, which makes sense since most of them are based in Japan. American comics, though, are an industry that's not where it was in the 90s. They can still be successful and profitable, but just not at the level that it used to be. This might be why there's less comics based on fighters. Since fighters are more niche, companies don't want to take that risk of making them if it's just gonna sit on the shelves. That being said, if you do want to go looking for physical copies of these, check a local comic book shop before going on like Amazon or something.